effectively reduce corruption. Maybe a quick remark about organized versus disorganized corruption. This is a nice point that was made by Schleifer and Vishny. So the idea there is that if you've got 20 licenses that you must get in order to start a business, each of the issuers of those licenses can demand a bribe. Now, if the issuer of license 1 increases his demand for a bribe, that's going to reduce the business of officials in charge of licenses 2, 3, etc., simply because doing business will become more expensive. But of course, official 1 is not going to take into account this bad effect that he's got on officials 2, 3, etc. What will happen if all of those officials were pooled together, so that all 20 licenses were obtained just from one guy? He will then recognize that charging a higher bribe reduces the volume of business he does. He's internalizing the negative externalities that demands for bribes bring. It's exactly the same way as those of you who've done a little bit of intermediate level microeconomics know that complementary goods are actually better sold by a single monopolist than by separate oligopolists, because the single monopolist will realize that increasing the price of one of those goods, say hardware, will decrease the demand for the other, software, and so will arrange the joint policy to maximize joint profits, and prices will be lower under a monopoly for complementary goods than they would for separate goods. This is kind of a nice economic theoretic point that's got an alternative practical interpretation. These kind of things are available in the form of one-stop agencies, which were actually designed for a different purpose. A lot of American states have that, basically to make it simpler for people to set up business in their state and therefore make it more attractive. All the licenses that you need, you'll get from that one place. And what I'm saying is that the same one-stop agency can also serve to reduce corruption. Why not carry that further? Why not have 2 separate offices, each of them with a one-stop licensing power? Then they'll start to compete with each other. If shop A, the office A, demands $10,000 for all of its 20 licenses, official B, who can also issue the same 20 licenses, will say, come to me and I'll do it for only 9,000. And that kind of competition will then again serve to reduce the total amount of corruption. Again, a throwaway suggestion that may be worth trying. Okay, let me then turn to contracts. That actually is kind of the more important part of what I want to talk about, and I hope there's a little bit of time left for it. The classic example of problems that arise in contracts was stated by Thomas Hobbes, and this is just beautiful. The usual idea is that in many contracts, people don't perform simultaneously. Person A does one thing first, person B does something else that will then benefit A later. So you might incur a very specific investment to fulfill an order, and then the other person will place the order. This creates a problem. When you have made that specific investment, you've sunk your capital, you've got no other use for it, and the person issuing the order now knows that they've got you in a good place, and they'll say, oh, we'll pay only less than what we had originally agreed. Williamson's hold-up problem. Similar problem studied by Avinash. And Thomas Hobbes knew that perfectly well. Read that old-style English, where neither of the parties perform presently. He that performs first has no assurance that the other will perform after. And therefore, that kind of contract will never occur in the first place without trust. It will be void. And this is the beautiful part. Because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's avarice. We now do beautiful mathematical models. We don't write beautiful English like that anymore. That's pity. So these kind of problems arise in all economic transactions except the classical market situations where good of a perfectly known quality is exchanged for instantaneous payments. And as soon as you depart from that, you need to do all kinds of things. You need to have repeated relationships so that misbehavior now will be punished by lack of business in the future. You will need to have some kind of an inspection of people you deal with to know whether they are good partners or bad partners. And if they misbehave anyway, you will need to have some way of punishing them, either immediately or later. There are a number of these kind of social institutions, and I like to differentiate them into first party, second party, and third party. First party will work on the internal incentives of the dealers in the first place. You will instill in them a system of values that they will not cheat in the first place. Second party are mechanisms to detect cheating, to punish cheating, etc., that are designed by people within the group of traders. And third party are those where you hire complete outsiders to do the thing for you, often for profit. First party institutions are generally neglected by economists, and because economists until recently used to simply assume that everybody is selfish. So nobody will behave nicely because that's the way that they're supposed to. But of course, in reality, these kind of pro-social behaviors are perfectly common. And what's more, societies go to deliberate lengths to instill that kind of thinking in people's minds. Through family training, you have to be nice, you have to share with others. Likewise in schools, and a lot of that sticks. And economists should recognize that these kind of incentives are often completely internalized very deliberately. And they can then actually be sustained rigorously in game theoretic models of evolutionary group selection. Second party institutions, this is what Bryce calls collectivist enforcement. And this is a classic example of Maghribi traders. Many of you probably know about this, but several of you probably don't, so I'll briefly recap. This was a group of Jewish traders in North Africa, the Maghreb, in like the 11th, even a little bit 12th century, where somebody who was dealing in, let's say, what's now Cairo, would have reason to assign goods for somebody in Tunis to sell on his behalf. What's the guarantee that the person in Tunis would deal honestly, sell them for the best price, remit that price, etc., rather than make excuses, oh sorry, I couldn't get a good enough price. What happened was that on suspicion of cheating, the guy in Cairo would write letters to all of his associates, like eBay's rating system in a primitive form. And the evidence against the guy in Tunis mounted, nobody would do business with him anymore. And it was the fear of that happening that would keep the guy in Tunis in the good behavior in the first place. And similar kind of things exist now. I mentioned eBay, there are things like industry associations and better business bureaus that provide similar kind of functions. Of course, if you're dealing with exactly the same person all the time, you can handle the punishment yourself. You don't need to write to 19 others who might be dealing with the other guy. And so there's a lot of reason for people deliberately to cultivate good bilateral relationships. But that may be impossible. It may simply be the case that there's a certain kind of transactions. Buying a house is an example where you do that very infrequently and you buy it from somebody you don't know and not going to deal with again. Always good to have dramatic examples that people remember of how multilateral governance may be unavoidable and therefore important to have. And my example is this. How many of you have heard of Yogi Berra? Very few. Okay. He's a famous American baseball player, manager, commentator, etc., who said things that at first sight seem completely stupid. Think about them just a little bit, and it turns out that they've got a kind of subtle wisdom about them. It ain't over till it's over, and the thing like that. But this is one of my favorites. Always go to other people's funerals, otherwise they won't come to yours. And this is a situation where this norm of going to other people's funerals has to be enforced on a multilateral basis. In its very nature, this could never be done bilaterally. Always good to have these kind of dramatic examples, but start thinking along these lines and you will see a lot of others where you have to have multilateral governance. And what kind? This is where third-party institutions become important. Maybe that there is somebody who can keep information very well. It may be a kind of credit rating agency that will tell you what the credit of a particular person is, and you are able to ask them and then deal with the person or not, as the case may be. There may be private adjudication, arbitration, etc. And maybe even enforcement for profit. And of course, enforcement possibly by the government's courts. Great example of these kind of third-party enforcement systems and information systems comes from Diego Gambetta's study of the Sicilian mafia. I don't know, how many of you have read Gambetta's book on the Sicilian mafia?